What would you do if the nursing home called to say they had never heard of your mother-in-law, the same woman your wife had been visiting every single weekend for 8 months? What if you discovered that your wife's mother was not dying in a bed 90 miles away, but buried in a cemetery you did not know existed? My name is Dan Carter. I am 44 years old, and this is the story of how a single phone call from a confused billing clerk unraveled 2 years of lies, $11,200 in stolen pension checks, and an affair that began at my mother-in-law's own funeral. I need to take you back to the beginning, to a town called Elyria, Ohio, about 30 miles west of Cleveland. Elyria is the kind of place where the Walmart is the social hub and the high school football game is the biggest event of the week. I had been a construction foreman at Lakewood Builders for 18 years, running crews of 8 to 12 men on residential and light commercial projects. My salary was $54,000 a year, which put us squarely in the middle class for Lorain County. My wife Stacy was 40 years old and worked as a receptionist at Creekside Dental, a small practice on Broad Street, where she answered phones and managed the appointment calendar for $34,000 a year. We had been married for 19 years, high school sweethearts who had built a life that was ordinary in every measurable way, and therefore, I believed, stable. We had a son named Kyle, who was 17, a junior at Elyria High School, and a part-time grocery bagger at the Giant Eagle on Chestnut Ridge Road, where he earned $9.75 an hour and saved every paycheck for a car he had been eyeing on Craigslist, a 2012 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles, listed at $4,800. Kyle was a quiet kid, thoughtful, the kind of teenager who listened more than he talked and noticed more than he let on. He got that from Ruth, Stacy's mother, who always said that the people who talk the most usually have the least worth saying. That observation would prove prophetic in ways none of us intended, and Kyle's quiet watchfulness would later become one of the most important elements of this entire story. Stacy's mother, Ruth Pelletier, had been the central figure in our family's emotional landscape for as long as I could remember. Ruth was a retired school lunch lady who had spent 31 years feeding children at Garfield Elementary and had the swollen knees and the sharp tongue to prove it. She was 71 years old when she was diagnosed with vascular dementia in the fall of 2022, and the diagnosis hit Stacy like a freight train. Ruth had always been the strongest person Stacy knew, a woman who raised 3 daughters alone after her husband walked out in 1989 and never looked back. Ruth's other 2 daughters were Linda, who lived in Columbus, and Denise, who had moved to North Carolina years ago. Both contributed what they could, but Stacy was the primary caregiver, the one who lived closest, the one who showed up. Watching her mother lose her memory, her independence, and eventually her ability to recognize her own children was the kind of slow-motion tragedy that grinds you down one day at a time. By February of 2023, Ruth could no longer live alone in her apartment in Mansfield, 90 miles south of Elyria. Stacy found a memory care facility called Maple Glen Assisted Living, a clean, well-reviewed place on Lexington Avenue that cost $4,200 a month. Ruth's Social Security checks, $1,412, covered about a third of it. The rest came from Ruth's modest savings and a small contribution from Stacy and me. $300 a month that we budgeted for and never complained about, because it was Ruth, and Ruth was family. That $300 would later become one of the threads that unraveled everything. Stacy started driving to Mansfield every Saturday morning. She would leave at 7, arrive by 8:30, spend the day with Ruth, and drive back in the evening, usually getting home by 7 or 8. I never questioned the routine. It was her mother, and the disease was cruel, and Stacy needed that time. Sometimes Kyle went with her, sometimes he did not. I rarely went, not because I did not care about Ruth, but because construction foreman work often bled into Saturdays and someone needed to keep the house running. I would mow the lawn, fix whatever needed fixing, do the grocery shopping, and have dinner ready when Stacy walked through the door looking exhausted and sad. I would listen to her stories about the visit and hold her hand and tell her she was a good daughter. This went on for over a year, every single weekend, and I believed every word. Looking back now, I can see the small changes that I missed. The way Stacy started putting on lipstick before the drive. The way she came home tired, but not sad the way she used to be. The way her visits started running longer and eventually turned into overnights. She started buying new clothes, nothing dramatic, just a blouse here and a pair of jeans there, but it was more than she had bought for herself in years. She started listening to music in the car again. I noticed because she left her phone connected to the Bluetooth one evening, and a playlist came up that I did not recognize, full of songs from the 90s that were not the kind of thing she usually listened to. But at the time, I chalked it all up to self-care, to her therapist's advice, to a woman finding small ways to cope with the slow loss of her mother. I think most people in a 19-year marriage would have done the same. You trust the person you have built your life with, and that trust becomes a blind spot so large that an entire secret life can hide inside it. My wife was visiting her dying mother. There was nothing in the world more natural or more heartbreaking, and there was nothing in the world less true. I would have gone on believing it indefinitely, for months, possibly years, possibly forever, if not for a routine records cleanup at a nursing facility 90 miles away, and a billing coordinator named Janet Moorhead, who decided, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, that a courtesy phone call was the professional thing to do. That decision, made by a woman I had never met over a matter that was not her responsibility, would change the course of my life, my son's life, and my wife's life in ways that none of us could have anticipated. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in January of 2025. I was at a job site in North Ridgeville, standing in a half-framed kitchen watching my crew install roof trusses when my cell phone rang. The caller ID said Maple Glen Assisted Living. I assumed it was about Ruth, maybe a medical update, maybe a billing question. I stepped outside into the January mud and answered. The woman on the line identified herself as Janet Moorhead, the billing coordinator. She said she was calling about the account for Ruth Pelletier, that there appeared to be an outstanding balance issue, and that she needed to speak with the family. I told her I was Ruth's son-in-law and asked what the problem was. Janet paused, and what she said next changed my life. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but we don't have a current resident by that name. Ruth Pelletier was discharged from our facility in May of last year." I said that was impossible. My wife visited Ruth at Maple Glen every Saturday. Janet paused again, longer this time. "Sir, I'm looking at our records right now. Ruth Pelletier was discharged on May 14, 2024. The discharge reason is listed as deceased. I assumed the family was aware. I asked her to repeat the date. May 14, 2024. I asked if she was certain. She was certain. I asked if there had been any contact from the family since May. She checked her records and said that Stacy had called on May 15th to arrange the body's transfer to a funeral home called Wapner Funeral Directors. After that, nothing. No calls, no visits, no forwarding address." I stood in the mud outside that half-built house and felt the world tilt sideways. Ruth was dead. Ruth had been dead for 8 months. My wife had been driving somewhere every Saturday for 8 months, coming home with stories about a woman who was buried in the ground. The monthly invoice had continued to go to Stacy's email, but since the account was closed, it was just an automated zero balance notification. Janet had been cleaning up old records and decided to call as a courtesy. A courtesy. That word will stay with me for the rest of my life, because that courtesy phone call was the thread that, when I pulled it, unraveled every lie my wife had told for 8 months. I sat in my truck in the job site parking lot for 40 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make the information fit into a shape that made any kind of sense. Ruth died on May 14th. Stacy called the funeral home on May 15th. Stacy had never told me. She had never told Kyle. She had continued to drive somewhere every Saturday, continued to come home with stories about good days and bad days, continued to accept the $300 a month that I contributed to Ruth's care that no longer existed because Ruth no longer existed. Where was that money going? Where was Stacy going? And the biggest question, the one that made my stomach clench, why would my wife hide her own mother's death from her family? I opened my phone's browser and searched for Ruth Pelletier, obituary, Mansfield, Ohio. The third result was from the Mansfield News Journal, dated May 16th. There it was, in black and white. Ruth Ann Pelletier, 73, passed away peacefully at Maple Glen, survived by 3 daughters. A private memorial will be held at the family's request. I stared at those words and felt something cold settle in my chest. A private memorial. Stacy had organized a funeral I never attended, a funeral Kyle never attended, a funeral we did not even know had happened. I drove home in a state of controlled numbness, arrived before Stacy got off work, and went straight to the attic. I did not know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew that if Stacy had hidden a funeral, there had to be physical evidence somewhere. The attic was our catch-all storage. Christmas decorations, old tax returns, Kyle's childhood artwork, boxes we kept because throwing them away felt like admitting they did not matter. I started opening them systematically, checking labels, peeling back lids, working through 15 years of accumulated life with the focus of a man who has just discovered that the foundation of his house might be cracked. The fourth box I opened, a plastic tote labeled Stacy, personal, in her neat handwriting, contained a manila envelope. Inside were the documents of a funeral I never attended, a program from Wapner Funeral Directors with Ruth's photo on the front and a Bible verse on the back, a receipt for cremation services totaling $2,315, paid by a credit card I had never seen, and a sympathy card signed by 6 people I did not recognize. One signature read, "With deepest sympathy, Liam." No last name, just Liam, in a confident, angular hand, with a small heart drawn next to the name. I held that card and stared at the heart and felt something shift inside me, a gear clicking into place, the beginning of a terrible understanding that was not yet fully formed, but was already too heavy to carry alone. Kyle found me in the attic. He had come home from school and heard me moving boxes above his bedroom. He climbed the pull-down ladder and saw me sitting on the plywood floor with the funeral program in my hands, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. I showed him the program. I showed him the obituary on my phone. I watched my 17-year-old son process the information that his grandmother, the woman who taught him to play cards and called him my little man until he was 14 and begged her to stop, had been dead for 8 months without anyone telling him. Kyle's face went through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, grief. He sat down next to me on the dusty plywood floor, and we stayed there together in silence until we heard Stacy's car pull into the driveway below. I did not confront Stacy that evening. I wanted to. Every cell in my body wanted to walk downstairs and slam that funeral program on the kitchen counter and demand an explanation. But something held me back. Maybe it was the same instinct that had kept me alive on construction sites for 18 years. When the ground is unstable, you do not charge forward. You stop. You assess. You figure out where the solid footing is. I needed to understand the full scope of what Stacy had been doing before I confronted her, because I had a feeling, a cold, crawling feeling in my gut, that the hidden funeral was not the whole story. There was the $300 a month, there was Ruth's Social Security, and there was the name Liam on a sympathy card written with a heart. That night I lay in bed next to my wife, staring at the ceiling, and I made a plan. I was going to investigate every thread of this lie before I said a single word to her. I owed that to Kyle, and I owed it to myself. The next morning, I pulled Kyle aside before school and told him to be patient, to act normal, to give Stacy no indication that we knew anything. Kyle nodded, quiet, observant, stubborn once he had made up his mind. His grandmother's grandson in every way. I also searched the house that morning, carefully, while Stacy was at work, looking for the credit card she had used to pay for Ruth's cremation. The $2,315 charge from Wapner Funeral Directors that appeared on the receipt I found in the attic. I found it in her nightstand drawer, underneath a novel. A Visa card from a bank I did not recognize, with Stacy's name on it. The card's existence told me something important. She had opened a separate line of credit without my knowledge, which meant the financial deception ran deeper than I had initially thought. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a methodical investigator in my own home. Every lunch break, I sat in my truck with a legal pad and our online banking statements, cross-referencing every transaction against what I knew about our spending patterns. Stacy handled our bills through the shared online portal, and I had the login credentials because we had always shared everything, or so I thought. I approached the investigation the way I approach a construction project, systematically, one element at a time, checking each connection before moving on to the next, never assuming anything was solid until I had verified it with my own hands. What I found in those statements was worse than anything I had imagined, and it turned my suspicion into certainty and my grief into something harder and colder and more useful. The $300 a month that I thought was going to Maple Glen was being transferred to an account I did not recognize, a savings account at a different bank, not linked to our joint checking. $300 on the first of every month since June, totaling $2,400. But that was only my money. I also noticed small anomalies I had overlooked. ATM withdrawals from banks we did not use, a gas station charge in a town called Belleville, a purchase at a flower shop in that same town, a restaurant charge from a place called the Wishmaker House that I could not find on any map I knew. Each transaction was small, $20 here, $35 there, but together they formed a trail that did not lead to Mansfield. I documented everything on my legal pad, date by date, amount by amount, building a timeline of deception 8 months long. The pad filled up. I started a second one. Ruth's Social Security checks were a different matter entirely. Social Security payments stop when a beneficiary dies, but only if the SSA is notified. Normally, the funeral home reports the death, and the SSA stops payments within a month or two. But if no one reports it, or if someone actively prevents the report, the checks keep coming. I searched our records and found that Stacy had set up a P.O. box at the Mansfield post office, Box 447, 6 days after Ruth's death. Ruth's checks, $1,412 each, had been redirected there. 8 months of checks totaled $11,296. I stared at that number on my legal pad and felt my hands go cold. My cousin Greg, a retired postal worker who still knew people at the Mansfield post office, confirmed everything. Box 447 was registered to S. Carter, rented May 20th, rental paid in cash. Greg told me the postal clerk remembered a woman matching Stacy's description, picking up mail every 2 weeks or so, always on a Saturday, always alone, always quick about it. Greg also told me something that made my blood run cold. Cashing a dead person's Social Security checks is a federal crime. Social Security fraud, punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison and fines up to $250,000. He said it with the casual authority of someone who had spent 30 years handling mail and had seen this kind of thing before. My wife had committed a felony. Not once, not accidentally, but 8 times, deliberately, month after month, for 8 months. The woman who packed lunches for our son and organized the church potluck every Thanksgiving and kept a tidy desk at Creekside Dental had been committing federal fraud with the regularity of a monthly subscription, and she had been doing it for the better part of a year. I sat with that knowledge for 2 days, going to work, coming home, sitting across the dinner table from a stranger, wearing my wife's face, saying nothing. I could not reconcile the woman I had married, the woman who cried at our wedding, who held my hand when Kyle was born, who once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring me soup at a job site, with the woman who existed in those bank statements and postal records. They felt like two different people, and I was married to both of them. I went to work each morning and ran my crew and inspected framing joints and checked load-bearing calculations, and the whole time a voice in the back of my mind asked the same question. How did I not see this? The answer, which Dr. Marsh would later help me understand, was that I was not looking. Nobody looks for betrayal in the one place they feel safest. Trust is the foundation of a marriage, and when the foundation is solid, you do not spend your days checking it for cracks. I hired a private investigator named Martin Doyle, a retired Lorain County Sheriff's deputy who ran a one-man operation out of his basement in Amherst. Martin charged $70 an hour, and his specialty was domestic cases. 20 years in law enforcement watching marriages fall apart, now his second career. I gave him the basics: Stacy's Saturday schedule, the Mansfield connection, the Belleville charges, the name Liam. His retainer was $400 from my personal savings at a credit union where I kept overtime pay, about $2,600. Martin asked me one question before I left. What outcome are you hoping for? I did not have an answer. I was not hoping for anything. I just needed to know what was real. He said he would start surveillance the following Saturday and have a written report for me within 10 days, maybe sooner if the situation turned out to be straightforward. It was not straightforward, but it was exactly what I feared. Martin conducted surveillance over 2 consecutive Saturdays, and his report arrived on February 8th. 12 pages of timestamps, photographs, and license plate records. On Saturday, February 1st, he followed Stacy from our house at 7:03 in the morning. She drove east on I-90 to I-71 south, toward Mansfield, the same route she would take to Maple Glen. But she did not exit at the Mansfield turnoff. She continued south to Belleville, about 15 miles past Mansfield, and pulled into the driveway of a 2-story farmhouse on State Route 97. Martin photographed the house, the address, and the mailbox, which read Novak. Public records showed the property was owned by Liam Novak, age 47, a widower whose wife Margaret had died of ovarian cancer in March of 2024, 2 months before Ruth died. Martin photographed Stacy entering the house at 9:45 in the morning. She did not come out until 4:30 in the afternoon, nearly 7 hours inside. The following Saturday, the same pattern: arrival at 9:30, departure at 4:15. The routine was mechanical, practiced, as regular as the Saturday visits to Maple Glen had once been. Martin also photographed something I would not have thought to look for. Stacy's Toyota Corolla had a Maple Glen visitor parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror. It was expired, valid through May 2024, but from a distance it looked like proof she was visiting the facility. She had kept it as a prop. On the second Saturday, Martin documented Stacy stopping at the Mansfield post office on her way to Belleville, 4 minutes inside, emerging with a small stack of envelopes. The P.O. box, the checks, the affair. Every piece was connecting to every other piece. I searched Liam Novak online and found a minimal presence: a Facebook profile with a farmhouse cover photo, a profile picture of a man with gray streaked hair standing next to a golden retriever, listed as a retired agricultural equipment sales representative, widowed, living in Belleville. I scrolled to a March 2024 memorial post for his wife, Margaret, with a photo from their 30th anniversary. In the comments, I found a reply from Stacy's personal account. "So sorry for your loss, Liam. Margaret was a wonderful woman." March 22nd, 7 weeks before Ruth died. Stacy later told me they met in the hospital cafeteria at Ohio Health Mansfield, during one of the times Ruth had been temporarily transferred from Maple Glen for an acute medical issue, a urinary tract infection that caused a dangerous spike in confusion. Liam's wife was in the oncology ward. Ruth was upstairs. 2 people alone in a cafeteria, watching the people they loved disappear. The specific origin mattered less than what came after. When Ruth died 2 months later, Liam Novak was the person Stacy turned to. Not me, her husband of 19 years, the father of her child, the man who had been paying $300 a month toward her mother's care without complaint. Not her sisters Linda or Denise, who had also lost their mother and would have understood the grief without any of the complications. She turned to a recently widowed stranger who understood what it felt like to lose someone slowly, piece by piece, day by day, because shared grief creates a kind of intimacy that can bypass every boundary a marriage is supposed to provide. I stared at his profile picture for a long time, this ordinary-looking man with his dog and his empty farmhouse, and I tried to hate him. I could not manage it. He had not made vows to me. Stacy had. Kyle, meanwhile, had been doing his own investigation. After that evening in the attic, I had told him to sit tight and let me handle things, but Kyle was not the kind of kid who could sit on information that mattered. He went through the family's shared iCloud account, the one we used for photo storage and calendar syncing, and noticed that Stacy's iPhone had location services enabled for the Find My app. Kyle tracked her phone on the second Saturday Martin was surveilling, working independently, without my knowledge, because he did not wait to be told what to do when something important was at stake. The data confirmed everything. Elyria to I-71 south to Belleville, her phone stationary at the Novak address for 6 hours and 42 minutes, then back to Elyria at 5:15. It never went anywhere near Mansfield or Maple Glen. My son had independently corroborated the PI's findings using a family phone tracking feature that Stacy had apparently forgotten existed. When Kyle showed me the screenshots in the garage, his jaw was set in a way that made him look 10 years older. He said, "Dad, what are we going to do?" I told him we were going to handle this the right way. He nodded, then said something that caught me off guard. I already looked up Social Security fraud, federal crime, up to 5 years. My 17-year-old son had been researching the legal consequences of his mother's crimes on his own, preparing himself for what was coming. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I was sorry he had to deal with this. He shook his head. "I'm sorry you do," he said, and in that moment, he sounded more like a man than a boy. We stood in the garage for a while, not talking, just being there, and then we went inside and had dinner with Stacy, as if nothing in the world was wrong. I took everything to an attorney, not a divorce attorney. First, a criminal defense attorney named Judith Kwan in downtown Cleveland, because my wife had committed Social Security fraud, and I needed to understand the implications for all of us. Judith was blunt. Federal offense, well above the felony threshold, possible prison time, restitution, fines. She also warned me that as Stacy's spouse, if I knowingly benefited from the stolen funds, I could face charges too. She recommended documenting my lack of knowledge, the Maple Glen phone call, the PI report, the $300 a month I had been paying under the belief Ruth was alive. That documentation would protect me. I left her office with a clear understanding of the legal landscape and the growing certainty that my marriage was over. All that remained was the confrontation itself. I spent the next week in suspended animation. Every evening at the dinner table, I listened to Stacy fabricate details about her mother. Mom had a good day. She remembered Linda's name, delivered with tired sincerity that would have been completely convincing if I did not know Ruth had been in the ground for 8 months. On Saturday, I watched her pack an overnight bag for her visit to Mom, telling me the doctor said Ruth might not have much longer. The cruelty of that lie, using her dead mother's non-existent decline as an excuse to spend the night with another man, was so breathtaking that I had to leave the room. I sat in the garage on an overturned bucket, palms pressed against my eyes, and Kyle found me there. He sat on the workbench and said, "How much longer?" I told him soon. 1 more week. He nodded and went inside to keep pretending. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening in late February. Kyle had gone to his friend Trevor's house for the night, a deliberate arrangement. I did not want him there when his mother's world collapsed. He hugged me before he left, unusual for him, and said, "You've got this, Dad." I spent the hour before Stacy came home, arranging everything on the kitchen table. The folder with all evidence organized chronologically with tabs: Maple Glen records, obituary, funeral program, bank statements, PI photographs, find my data. 19 years of marriage reduced to a manila folder on a kitchen table. Stacy walked in at 5:40, put her purse on the counter, started talking about a rude patient at the dental office. I let her finish. I let her sit down. I let her pour a glass of water. Then I told her everything I knew. I said, "Ruth died on May 14th. You held a funeral without telling me or Kyle. You have been cashing her Social Security checks, 8 of them, totaling $11,296. You have a P.O. box in Mansfield under your initial, and every Saturday for the last 8 months, you have been driving to a farmhouse in Belleville to see a man named Liam Novak." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. The color drained from her face in stages: cheeks, lips, ears. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, building the case document by document, until the folder was empty and the table was covered with the wreckage of our marriage. I sat back and waited. This was the moment I had been preparing for, and now that it was here, I felt strangely calm, like a man who has been dreading a surgery and finally hears the anesthesiologist say, "Count back from 10. Stacy did not deny it. I had expected tears, excuses, deflection. I had prepared counter-arguments for every defense. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning rehearsing responses. None of that was necessary. She sat very still, looked at the evidence, and said, "I was going to tell you." Quietly, without conviction, like someone reading a line they no longer believed. I waited. Martin Doyle had coached me. Let her fill the void. People who have been lying for months are exhausted by the weight of it. Give them an opening and they will pour it all out. After nearly a minute of silence, Stacy put both hands flat on the table, took a shuddering breath, and started talking. The story came out in pieces at first, then in a flood she could not stop. And it was both simpler and more complicated than I had imagined. She said she had been drowning. Ruth's illness had consumed her for 2 years. The drives, the guilt, watching her mother forget her name, the financial strain, the horror of seeing the strongest woman she knew reduced to someone who could not use a fork. She met Liam at the Ohio Health Mansfield Hospital cafeteria in February of 2024. Ruth had been temporarily transferred from Maple Glen for a urinary tract infection that spiked her confusion, and Liam's wife Margaret was in the oncology ward. They talked over bad coffee. Liam understood her grief in a way that I, she said, never could. Not because I was a bad husband, but because I was not there. I was at job sites, managing crews, keeping the house running. She was grateful, but gratitude was not the same as being understood. When Margaret died in March, Stacy comforted Liam. When Ruth died in May, Liam comforted Stacy. Comfort became something else. I told her that things that just happen once are accidents. Things that just happen every Saturday for 8 months are choices. She flinched, and for the first time that evening, I saw tears. Not the kind of tears I had expected, not the dramatic, performative tears of someone trying to generate sympathy, but the quiet, defeated tears of someone who had been caught and knew it and had no energy left to pretend otherwise. I asked about the funeral. She said it was small, just a service at Wapner Funeral Directors, with Ruth's 2 other daughters Linda and Denise, a few of Ruth's friends from church, and Liam, who came because he understood loss. I asked the question that had been burning in me for weeks. Why did Linda and Denise never call me? Why did Ruth's other 2 daughters attend their mother's funeral and never once pick up the phone to say, "Dan, we are sorry about your mother-in-law"? Stacy looked down at the table. She said she had told them that I knew. She told Linda and Denise that she had called me the day Ruth died, that I had chosen not to attend the funeral because I could not get off work, and that Kyle was too upset to come. She told them our family was grieving privately and preferred not to discuss it. Linda, who had only recently moved from Columbus to North Olmsted and was dealing with her own divorce and the upheaval that comes with rebuilding a life in a new city, accepted this explanation without question. Denise, living in North Carolina with limited involvement in the family's daily dynamics, had no reason to doubt her sister. I felt physically sick. She had not only lied to me, she had lied about me to the very people who would have told me the truth if they had known I did not already know it. She had built a wall of deception around every person who could have exposed her, and she had maintained it for 8 months. I asked about the Social Security checks. She said they were an accident at first. She forgot to notify the SSA. The first check arrived in June. She cashed it and planned to return the money later. She never did. She cashed the second, the third, the fourth. The money went to the P.O. box rental, gas, a few gifts for Liam, a collar for his golden retriever, garden tools for his birthday, and the rest accumulated in the account untouched. She knew it was wrong, knew it was illegal, told herself each month she would stop. She could not, because stopping one lie meant stopping all of them. The fraud and the affair were entangled. Ending the Social Security fraud meant reporting Ruth's death, which killed the Saturday cover story, which exposed the affair. Every lie was load-bearing. Remove one, and the whole structure collapsed. I asked the hardest question last. Did you ever plan to tell me that your mother was dead? She looked at me, and I saw the answer before she said it. I do not know. 3 words containing the entire architecture of her deception. She did not know if she was ever going to tell me and Kyle that Ruth was dead, ever going to stop driving to Belleville, ever going to return the money. She had built a parallel life and had been living in it so long it felt more real than ours. I sat with that answer for a long time, and then I asked one more thing. Did you love him? She hesitated, and the hesitation told me as much as her answer. I needed him, she said. I don't know if that's the same thing. I told her she needed to leave the house for the night. She did not argue. She packed a bag, slowly, like someone moving through water, and drove to Linda's apartment in North Olmsted. After she left, I called Kyle. I told him everything. The confrontation, the confession, the lies about us she had told her sisters. He listened without interrupting, which was Kyle's way. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then he said, "Dad, I'm coming home." He was at the house within the hour. We sat together in the living room until midnight, the television off, the house quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. At one point, Kyle said, "She lied about us to Aunt Linda and Aunt Denise. She told them we knew. She made it so nobody could help us." The clarity of that observation cut through the fog I had been operating in for weeks. He was right. Stacy had not just lied to us. She had isolated us inside the lie, making sure that no one on the outside would think to reach in and pull us out. Kyle also said something else that night that I have thought about many times since. He said, "I keep thinking about all the Saturdays I could have gone with her, and she would have had to take me to the real Maple Glen or explain why she was driving past it. She must have been relieved every time I said no." He was right about that too. Every Saturday that Kyle chose to stay home and work his shift at Giant Eagle or hang out with friends was a Saturday that Stacy's cover story survived without being tested. Kyle's independence had been weaponized against us without his knowledge, and the realization of that made him angrier than anything else. That night was the night I stopped being a husband and started being a father first, and it was one of the most important nights of my life. The next morning, I called Beth Calhoun. Beth practiced family law out of a shared office on Middle Avenue in Elyria, $175 an hour, recommended by a coworker. She reviewed every piece of evidence and told me the fraud complicated the divorce. A felony conviction could affect custody, asset division, and Stacy's employment. Beth recommended filing on grounds of incompatibility and adultery, Ohio allows fault-based divorce, and reporting the fraud separately. I called the SSA fraud hotline the next day, 1-800-269-0271, and an agent took the report and assigned a case number. Special Agent Thomas Russo from the Office of the Inspector General called 3 days later, professional and methodical. He said this type of fraud, continued benefits after death, was among the most common they investigated. He requested documentation, Maple Glen records, obituary, bank statements, P.O. Box registration. Russo was particularly interested in the 6-day gap between Ruth's death and the P.O. Box opening, which he said demonstrated premeditation rather than negligence. He explained that the investigation would involve interviewing Stacy at the OIG field office in Cleveland, subpoenaing banking records from both the joint account and the separate savings account, and coordinating with the Mansfield post office to obtain surveillance footage and transaction records from Box 447. He estimated 6 to 8 weeks and told me to expect follow-up calls as the investigation progressed. He also told me, in a matter-of-fact way that suggested he had said it many times before, that this type of fraud was more common than most people think, and that many cases involved family members who continued collecting benefits out of a combination of grief, financial need, and the simple inertia of not reporting a death. The divorce moved faster than the federal investigation. Beth filed on February 24th, and the petition was served to Stacy at Creekside Dental on February 27th. I was not there when it happened, but Beth told me later that Stacy had accepted the papers quietly, without a scene, which was consistent with the woman I had confronted at our kitchen table. Someone who had already spent all her fight on maintaining the lie and had nothing left for defending against its consequences. Stacy retained Paul Mednick, a solo practitioner from Avon Lake who specialized in family law. The proceedings were contentious from the start. Beth argued for an unequal division of marital assets based on financial dissipation, $11,296 in stolen checks, $2,400 in diverted care payments, and PI costs, totaling approximately $14,096. Our assets were modest, which made the dissipation finding all the more significant. The house was appraised at $178,000, with a remaining mortgage of $67,000, giving us equity of $111,000. My 401k had $43,000. Stacy's had $19,000. We had joint savings of $8,000 and a checking balance that averaged about $2,000. These were not the assets of wealthy people. These were the assets of a working-class couple in their 40s who had spent 19 years building something careful and modest, one paycheck at a time, one overtime shift at a time, one packed lunch instead of a restaurant meal at a time. The $14,000 Stacy had dissipated represented a meaningful percentage of everything we had built together, and Beth made that point repeatedly in her filings. The judge, it turned out, understood what those numbers meant for a family like ours. Mednick argued that the Social Security checks were not marital assets and therefore should not factor into the property division, and that Stacy's emotional state, the grief, the caregiver burnout, the depression she had been formally diagnosed with after the divorce filing, constituted mitigating circumstances that the court should consider when evaluating her conduct. He painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by 2 years of caregiving, broken by her mother's death, isolated in her grief, and too psychologically fragile to make rational decisions about the checks, the P.O. box, or anything else. Beth countered, forcefully, that the $300 a month I had been paying for non-existent care was absolutely a marital asset that had been fraudulently diverted, and that the 6-day gap between Ruth's death and the P.O. box opening demonstrated planning, not fragility. The back and forth consumed weeks of motions and responses and hearings, each one costing money we could not easily spare, each one peeling another layer from a marriage that had looked solid from the outside but had been hollowed out within. Beth filed a motion to compel disclosure of the separate savings account records, which Mednick resisted and lost. The records showed exactly what I already knew: the steady accumulation of stolen Social Security checks and my diverted care payments, barely touched, growing month by month like a tumor. Through all of it, I kept going to work, kept coming home, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because that is what you do when you are a construction foreman from Elyria, Ohio, and your life is falling apart. You frame walls, you check plumb lines, you make sure the foundation is level. You do not stop building just because something else is collapsing. And you wait for the court to do its work, the same way you wait for concrete to cure. Patiently, because rushing it only makes the result weaker. Kyle's role in the proceedings was significant. At 17, his preference carried weight in Ohio custody law. He met with the court-appointed guardian ad litem, retired family court judge William Ostrowski, 3 times over 2 weeks. Kyle was calm, articulate, and devastating in his clarity. He said he loved his mother but could not trust her, and that trust was more important than love right now. He described learning his grandmother had been dead for 8 months, the grief, yes, but also the betrayal of being denied the chance to say goodbye. He said it felt like being robbed of something he could never get back, something that no apology or explanation could restore. Ostrowski noted in his report that Kyle demonstrated unusual maturity and a clear understanding of the family dynamics, and expressed measured disappointment that reflects the gravity of the deception. Stacy did not contest primary custody. I think part of her knew that fighting Kyle on this would only push him further away, and she had already lost enough. She agreed to every other weekend visitation and child support of $430 per month based on Ohio guidelines, with provisions for holidays and school breaks, and a stipulation that Kyle could increase time with her at his own discretion as he grew more comfortable. The custody agreement also required Stacy to continue individual therapy, which her own attorney had suggested as a way to demonstrate her commitment to personal accountability. Beth told me privately that this was one of the smoothest custody negotiations she had seen in a case this emotionally charged, and I think that was because both Stacy and I, despite everything, wanted the same thing for Kyle: stability. The federal investigation concluded in April. Special Agent Russo informed Stacy, through her criminal defense attorney, whom she had retained separately from Paul Mednick, that the Office of the Inspector General had confirmed she had unlawfully received $11,296 in Social Security benefits following the death of Ruth Pelletier. Every detail had been verified: the P.O. Box registration, the check endorsements in Stacy's handwriting, the bank deposits, and the fact that the SSA had never been formally notified of Ruth's death. Stacy was offered a choice: repay the full amount and accept an administrative penalty, or face criminal prosecution. Beth and I discussed this at length, and we agreed that prosecution would serve no one. Not me, not Kyle, not even Stacy. She was Kyle's mother, and a felony conviction would follow her for the rest of her life, making it harder for her to find work, harder for her to rebuild, and ultimately harder for Kyle, who would carry the weight of a convicted parent into every conversation and relationship. Stacy accepted the administrative resolution. She repaid the full $11,296 from the separate savings account, which held $13,800, meaning she had barely spent any of the stolen money. It had just been sitting there, month after month, a digital pile of guilt and inertia. She also received a 10-year ban on receiving any Social Security benefits in her own name, which would significantly affect her eventual retirement. The divorce was finalized on May 2, 2025. I received 60% of the home equity, $66,600, and Stacy received 40%, $44,400. I kept the house. The retirement accounts were split proportionally, adjusted for the financial dissipation finding. No alimony was awarded. Judge Patricia Hendricks noted in her ruling that the respondent's sustained pattern of deception, including concealment of a parent's death and misappropriation of federal benefits, constitutes extraordinary circumstances warranting an unequal division of marital assets. I sat in that courtroom and heard those words and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not relief. Just the heavy, exhausted numbness of a man who had spent 4 months dismantling a life he thought was real. Kyle sat behind me in the gallery in a button-down shirt he had ironed himself, and when we walked out of the courthouse into the May sunshine, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "It's over, Dad." It was not over. Not emotionally. Not by a long distance. But the legal machinery had finished its work, and there was something to be said for that. Stacy was there too, walking out of the courthouse separately with Paul Mednick, and for a moment our eyes met across the parking lot. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, older. She did not wave or nod or try to speak to me. She just got into her car and drove away, and I stood there and watched her go and thought about the first time I had seen her, in the hallway of Elyria High School in 1999, wearing a yellow sundress and laughing at something her friend had said. That girl was gone. That boy who had fallen for her was gone too. We drove home in silence, and when we pulled into the driveway, Kyle said he wanted to visit Grandma Ruth. I said yes. The months after the divorce were shaped by absence. The absence of Stacy from the house, the absence of the Saturday routine I had maintained for years, and, most profoundly, the absence of Ruth. I had never properly mourned my mother-in-law. Her death had been stolen from me, not by the disease, but by Stacy's decision to hide it. For the first few weeks, I found myself reaching for my phone on Saturday mornings to text Stacy and ask how Ruth was doing, then remembering, then feeling the loss all over again. It was grief layered on top of grief. I was mourning Ruth and mourning my marriage simultaneously, and the two losses were so tangled together that I could not always tell which one was making my chest ache at any given moment. Dr. Marsh, my therapist, said this was normal, that compound grief is one of the hardest things the human mind has to process. I drove to Mansfield in June, alone, on a Saturday morning, taking the same route Stacy had taken every week for 2 years. The drive was 90 miles of Ohio highway that I had never made by myself, and it was beautiful in a way that felt like mockery. Green fields, blue sky, the kind of early summer day that makes you forget how gray the winters are. I found Ruth's grave at Mansfield Memorial Park, a small headstone with her name and dates and the words, "Beloved Mother." There were no flowers, no flags, no evidence that anyone had visited in a long time. I brought a bouquet of yellow roses, Ruth's favorite, the same kind she used to grow in the side yard of her Mansfield apartment before the dementia made her forget to water them. I sat on the grass next to her grave and I talked to her. I told her I was sorry I was not at her funeral. I told her Kyle was doing well, that he was turning into a man she would be proud of. I told her that her daughter had made terrible choices, but that I believed, somewhere under all the lies, Stacy had loved her genuinely. I told her about the divorce, about Kyle's courage in front of the guardian ad litem, about how much I missed her sharp tongue and her unsolicited opinions about my cooking. I told her about the gas station hot dogs that Kyle and I had been eating at the beach, and I thought I could almost hear her say, "Daniel Carter, if you feed that boy one more hot dog, I will haunt you." I sat there for an hour, and when I stood up, my knees ached from the cold ground, and I felt something I had not felt in months. A small, fragile sense of closure. 2 weeks later, I brought Kyle back to the same spot, and he left a card on her grave that he had written himself. He did not show me what it said, and I did not ask. Kyle and I rebuilt our life on Maple Drive with the quiet determination of two people who have been through something terrible and decided to keep going anyway. I cut back on Saturday overtime and started spending those mornings with Kyle, teaching him basic carpentry, working on the house together, occasionally driving to the lakeshore at Huntington Beach to watch the waves roll in off Lake Erie and eat gas station hot dogs, which Kyle claimed were the best food in Ohio, with the casual authority of a 17-year-old who had not yet discovered good sushi. We painted the kitchen together one weekend, a color called Morning Fog, that Kyle picked out at the hardware store because he said the old yellow reminded him too much of his mother and the life we used to have. He wanted the house to feel like it belonged to us now, to the two of us who remained, not to the family we used to be. And I understood that impulse completely because I felt the exact same way every time I walked through the front door and saw the spaces where Stacy's things used to be. Kyle continued to see Stacy every other weekend, and their relationship was cautious but functional. The first few visits were strained. Kyle told me they mostly sat in her new apartment in North Olmsted watching television without talking, the silence between them heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Kyle said once, on the drive home from one of those visits, that the hardest part was not the anger or even the sadness. It was not knowing which version of his mother was real. Was she the woman who packed his lunch every morning for 12 years? Or was she the woman who hid his grandmother's death for 8 months? He could not figure out how to be someone's son when he did not know who that someone really was. But over time, slowly, they began to rebuild something. Not what they had before, which was gone forever, but something new, built on honesty rather than the quicksand of deception. Stacy was in therapy twice a week, and Kyle said she seemed different. She never saw Liam Novak again, at least not that I knew of. I started seeing a therapist myself, a man named Dr. Kevin Marsh, who had an office above a bakery on East Avenue in Elyria. The bakery made excellent cinnamon rolls, and I developed a habit of buying one before every session, which Dr. Marsh said was a healthy coping mechanism compared to most of what he saw. We talked about trust, about grief, about the strange double-layered loss I had experienced, losing both my wife and my mother-in-law in a way that tangled the two losses together into a knot I could not untie. Dr. Marsh helped me see that Stacy's deception was not just about the affair or the money. It was about control. Control over the narrative of Ruth's death, over how and when I was allowed to grieve, over my understanding of my own life. By hiding Ruth's death, Stacy had taken away my right to mourn, to attend the funeral, to say goodbye. That theft, the theft of grief, was, in many ways, more devastating than the affair itself. 1 year later, I was standing in Ruth's old room at our house, the room we had kept set up for her visits before she went to Maple Glen, which I had finally decided to convert into a workshop. It had taken me a long time to be ready for that change, longer than I expected. The room had been a kind of shrine, not to Ruth exactly, but to the version of our family that existed before everything fell apart. Kyle was helping me move the bed frame into the garage when we found a card wedged between the mattress and the wall. A birthday card Ruth had written to Kyle 3 years earlier, before the dementia took her words away. It said, "To my little man, you have your grandfather's stubborn head and your mother's good heart. Use them both wisely. Love always, Grandma Ruth." Kyle read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his wallet. He looked at me and said, "She was right about the stubborn part anyway." I laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. We finished clearing the room, and I started setting up my workbench, and through the window, I could see the backyard where Ruth used to sit in her lawn chair and tell Kyle stories about the old days in Mansfield. Stories about the children she fed at Garfield Elementary, about the husband who left and the life she built without him, about the way things used to be in a world that no longer existed. The chair was gone, but the patch of grass where it sat was still slightly worn, a small imprint in the earth where something important used to be. I stood at the window and looked at that worn patch of grass and thought about all the things that leave marks when they disappear. The chair, the marriage, the woman who sat in both and held our family together with nothing but stubbornness and love. I do not know what my life will look like in 5 years or 10. I know that I am 45 years old and single and living in a house that is too quiet and working a job that pays just enough. I know that my son is applying to college, Ohio State, his first choice, with a partial scholarship application pending, and that I am going to miss him terribly when he leaves, because he has become not just my son, but my closest friend, the person who stood beside me when everything fell apart and never once wavered. I know that I will never fully understand why Stacy did what she did, why she chose to hide her mother's death, to steal from the government, to carry on an affair built on the foundation of shared mourning. I know that I forgave her, eventually, not because she deserved it, but because carrying the anger was heavier than setting it down. And I know this. The phone call from Maple Glen Assisted Living on that January Tuesday did not just expose a lie. It gave me back the truth. The truth about my marriage, the truth about my wife, and the truth about myself. The truth was painful and ugly, and it cost me almost everything I had built over 19 years of what I thought was a good and honest life. But it was mine, and nobody could hide it from me anymore. And there is a kind of freedom in that. A hard, cold, lonely freedom, but freedom nonetheless. If I have learned anything from this experience, it is that the people who love you the most are sometimes capable of hurting you the worst, and that surviving that hurt does not make you stronger or wiser or better. It just makes you someone who survived, and sometimes that is enough. Justice had been served. The guilty were punished. The innocent were healing, and we had made it through together. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We will see you in the next one.